German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The symbolism itself was quite significant. Britain left the European Union in 2020. The plan was to chart its own future in the world, not to hitch itself to Brussels. But more than 5 years later, is London having second thoughts? Are they regretting Brexit? Well, the visiting leaders are. Both Macron and Merz had the same thing to say.
To my personal deep and lasting regret, the United Kingdom has left the European.
You're standing on a train platform in Birmingham, or maybe Leeds, or the outskirts of London. It's raining, obviously, and your train was supposed to be here 20 minutes ago. When you check your phone, the ticket price has gone up by 5% since last year. But the service has somehow gotten worse. You're tired. You've been working harder than ever, yet your bank account looks exactly the same as it did in...
National debt now stands at £2.6 trillion, equivalent to 94% of GDP. Before the mini-budget, our borrowing costs were in the middle of the pack compared to other advanced economies. But now, we have the highest borrowing costs of any G7 country. Today, 1 in every £10 of taxpayers' money is spent on debt interest. Not paying that debt down, but just paying the interest.
The British economy is in a bit of a mess at the moment, to put it mildly. Unemployment is rising, salaries are stagnating, houses are unaffordable, cities are going bankrupt, and our public utilities are in dire disrepair, and people are covering this shortfall with debt. But what if I told you that we've actually been here before, and that this slump was set in motion almost 60 years ago, with these...
Now, on Christmas, we will carry on as we've started, action, not words. We will introduce legislation and take decisions to protect taxpayers' money, to take on the blockers by accelerating planning to build homes and boost growth. We will forward this autumn to harness the full potential of AI for growth and for the public good. We'll bring rail service into public ownership, putting passengers first. The biggest levelling up of workers' rights in a generation, to give people security, dignity and respect at work. And Great British Energy will be owned by the taxpayer, making money for the taxpayer.
The tension had been building for years, but few in Britain believed it would reach this point. At first, the outflow seemed small young families, entrepreneurs, remote workers, and small investors quietly relocating to African cities that were once dismissed as emerging markets. But the numbers grew relentlessly, and within a few short years, the movement became impossible to ignore. Headlines across London finally acknowledged the truth. Millions were leaving the UK for Africa. Government officials attempted to downplay the situation, calling it a temporary trend, but the truth was undeniable. Britain was facing something it had never experienced in the modern era, not immigration for adventure or retirement, but a mass exodus driven by economic survival. What began as a slow trickle had turned into a powerful current, and that current was dragging the UK economy into a crisis it was never prepared to face. The reasons for leaving were etched into every departing passenger's face: soaring energy costs, crumbling public services, unstable housing markets, and a job sector drying up like a drought-stricken field. Many felt they were living in a country that had lost its confidence. Meanwhile, Africa was experiencing something entirely different. Its cities were buzzing with growth, new digital hubs, expanding industries, and ambitious continental trade alliances. The contrast was sharp, enough to sting. Those who moved south described Africa as a place where the future was happening in real time. The UK, in comparison, felt stuck like a machine whose gears were rusted. Companies were relocating, new energy projects were emerging, manufacturing zones were multiplying, and digital innovation hubs were pulling talent from around the world. Opportunities were expanding, and African nations were actively positioning themselves as global growth engines. British authorities first blamed the migration on remote work trends, then on lifestyle choices, then on global economic pressures. But deep down, every policymaker knew what the public did not. The UK was losing skilled labor, investment capital, tax revenue, and consumer demand at a rate unseen in modern history. And the destination absorbing all that valuable human and economic capital was Africa. The financial sector, once Britain's pride, was among the first to feel the blow. Analysts reported decreasing deposits, fewer new businesses opening, and an alarming number of accounts being closed or moved abroad. In private meetings, banking executives warned ministers that the exodus was accelerating. surveys revealed that nearly a third of British professionals aged 32-50 were considering leaving within the next decade, a statistic that triggered panic in government circles. Businesses across central London were shuttering. Empty office buildings towered like grey reminders of the talent and investment that had slipped away. Restaurants closed earlier, shops saw reduced foot traffic, and major companies quietly froze recruitment. Waves of layoffs followed, fueling more departures. Every departure carried another consequence. More young professionals left the tax base, leaving fewer people to support an aging population. More entrepreneurs moved their skills and ideas abroad, diminishing innovation and stagnating the domestic market. More investors shifted their focus to Africa's fast-growing industries: renewable energy, digital finance, manufacturing, agritech, mining, logistics, creative arts, leaving Britain's traditional sectors gasping for relevance. Meanwhile, Africa was benefiting from the influx in ways that stunned economists, skilled workers arriving from the UK boosted local industries. Remittances were reversed. Entire neighborhoods were revitalized as new residents contributed to local economies. British entrepreneurs brought expertise that meshed with African ambition, creating new startups, new collaborations, and new trade bridges. Some African governments even created relocation packages specifically targeted at dissatisfied UK workers. Tax breaks, startup incentives, land lease programs, tech visas, and grants for manufacturing investments. These incentives made headlines worldwide and ignited fresh waves of migration. British officials privately panicked. They could not compete, not because they lacked resources, but because they lacked direction. Africa's growth was driven by clarity of purpose. The UK's decline was fueled by uncertainty. It didn't help that the cost of living in Britain climbed relentlessly. Fuel prices soared, mortgage rates hit record highs, and basic goods became unaffordable for families that once lived comfortably. Public services, strained and understaffed, delivered less while costing more. The sense of national decline could be felt everywhere, from crowded trains that rarely arrived on time to empty storefronts that once symbolized economic strength. The media attempted to frame the exodus as an overreaction, but the truth was harder to hide each month. African cities were rising organically, energetically, confidently. New infrastructure projects connected ports to hinterlands. High-speed internet networks grew across rural and urban areas. Manufacturing hubs expanded at twice Germany's rate. Education reforms produced highly skilled graduates. Startups flourished in fintech, biotech, agriculture, and clean energy. While the UK shrank, Africa surged, and the consequences of this divergence were massive. Real estate prices in some UK regions collapsed as more people moved out than moved in. Schools closed due to low enrollment. Local councils struggled to fund even basic services. Pensions became unstable as fewer young workers contributed to the system. Healthcare staffing shortages intensified. For the first time in decades, British citizens openly questioned whether the country could remain a global economic power. The shock hit the government hardest when reports confirmed that over 1 million small and medium-sized businesses had shifted part or all of their operations to African nations in the last 5 years. From outsourcing to direct relocation, companies were following the people. Africa offered cheaper energy, better growth prospects, and more welcoming regulatory environments. The UK, weighed down by bureaucracy and stagnation, could not keep up. Trade between the UK and Africa began to favor the African side in unprecedented ways. British imports soared while exports dwindled. African producers gained leverage in negotiations, while British suppliers became replaceable. The UK's manufacturing sector, already weakened, reached a tipping point as more factories closed or scaled back operations due to labor shortages. And then came the breaking point, one that economists had quietly predicted for years. The British currency experienced a sudden, sharp decline after several top-tier international investors announced they were shifting billions into African markets. The decision triggered immediate market panic. Stocks fell, bond yields rose, and the housing market contracted overnight. For the first time in generations, London was no longer seen as the safest investment destination in the region. Panic spread through financial districts. Long lines formed outside banks. News outlets scrambled to explain what was happening. Ministers held emergency meetings, but even as they tried to reassure the public, Africa continued to rise. In Nairobi, Kigali, Accra, Johannesburg, Lagos, Cairo, Addis Ababa, and Gaborone, new partnerships were being signed. Infrastructure zones expanded. Young entrepreneurs pitched new ideas to global investors. Diplomats negotiated deals that positioned Africa as a central economic force in the decades ahead. And in the middle of it all were millions of former UK residents working, investing, starting families, building futures. The shift was no longer reversible. The United Kingdom tried to launch retention programs, tax cuts, innovation grants, immigration reforms, but they came too late. The narrative had already changed. Africa was the land of opportunity, and Britain was the place people left behind. A quiet truth emerged in government circles. The country had underestimated Africa's rise and overestimated its own resilience. The loss of millions of workers and investors had magnified every weakness in the UK economy, accelerating a decline that might have otherwise unfolded over decades. By the time policymakers acknowledged the depth of the crisis, the transformation was complete. Africa had become a magnet for global talent, and the UK was struggling to hold on to what remained. The migration was no longer seen as a trend but as a historic shift, one that economists would later describe as the turning point when Africa became the new engine of global growth and Britain stumbled into a prolonged era of economic uncertainty. In the end, the story was not about those who left but about the nations that evolved. Africa rose because it embraced change. The UK faltered because it resisted it, and millions of ordinary people, seeking nothing more than opportunity and dignity, became the catalysts of a global power shift no one had expected. The lesson was simple, yet profound. When people move, economies move, and when millions move, history changes. The turning point came quietly at first, almost hidden beneath the noise of Britain's domestic debates. Yet, for those who watched global markets closely, the signs were unmistakable. The momentum of Africa's rise had reached a stage where even slight policy shifts across the continent produced ripple effects that shook London. As financial districts, a report released by a global economic forum stunned British policymakers. It revealed that African nations had collectively overtaken the UK in attracting foreign direct investment for the third consecutive year. Analysts pointed to the same underlying force: the millions of migrants from Britain and Europe who were now building businesses, contributing to talent pools, and strengthening Africa's urban economies. The influx made African markets more diverse, more globally connected, and more innovation-driven. British leaders attempted to downplay the implications, but investors were not fooled. They began redirecting capital into African markets with a level of confidence rarely seen before. Sectors like renewable energy, agribusiness, real estate, logistics, fintech, and manufacturing received massive boosts. African stock markets surged, government bond yields stabilized, new bilateral partnerships were created that further strengthened continental economic integration. Across Africa's major cities, new skylines emerged, testaments to both domestic ambition and international investment. Construction cranes dotted the horizon. Tech parks opened in districts once overlooked. Industrial zones hummed with new energy. Export routes expanded, ports modernized, rail lines connected regions that had long operated separately. The transformation was visible, tangible, and irreversible. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the opposite trend took hold. The government's fears about demographic decline were finally confirmed. When census reports revealed that the population had shrunk for the first time in modern British history, the loss was most pronounced among working-age adults, the very demographic that kept economies vibrant, innovative, and productive. Businesses warned of labor shortages across nearly every critical sector, from healthcare to engineering to logistics. This shortage sparked a desperate attempt to court foreign workers, but the campaign failed to gain momentum. Many potential migrants simply found Africa more attractive. Several African countries, once net exporters of talent, were now importers of global expertise, reversing decades of brain drain. The UK, once a magnet for global talent, now faced the reality of brain drain itself. As more people left, public finances took a devastating hit. Tax revenues fell sharply. Local councils issued warnings about collapsing budgets. Infrastructure projects stalled. Schools merged or closed. Hospitals experienced unprecedented staffing gaps. The economy strained under the weight of an aging population with fewer workers. To support pension commitments, the most unexpected shift came from the corporate world. Multinational companies announced plans to expand or relocate their headquarters to African capitals where economic potential far outweighed stagnation. These announcements made front-page news in Britain and triggered waves of analysis on prime-time broadcasts. Commentators asked the same question: how did the UK lose so many advantages so quickly? Yet the answer was not complicated. It was a combination of internal stagnation and external opportunity. As Africa rose, the UK fell behind. As African nations offered stability, innovation, and growth, Britain struggled with inflation, political uncertainty, and rising living costs for millions of individuals and thousands of companies. The decision to move was not ideological, it was practical. Inside the UK, a quiet panic began spreading among policymakers. They feared that the country was entering an era similar to the post-industrial downturn that hit parts of northern England decades earlier, only this time it was national, not regional. They commissioned studies on population renewal, workforce sustainability, technological competitiveness, and global positioning. The conclusions were grim. Without reversing the outflow, the UK would face long-term economic contraction, but reversing the outflow proved nearly impossible. The opportunities in Africa were simply too compelling. Nations offered streamlined business laws, low taxation for startups, ample land for agriculture and manufacturing, and energy prices far more manageable than those in the UK, with the African Continental Free Trade Area creating the world's largest free trade zone by population. Entrepreneurs had access to a vast market spanning dozens of countries. For investors and workers alike, the future was clearly shifting. As Britain watched its economic landscape transform, African nations continued to strengthen their alliances. New regional corridors connected manufacturing hubs with mineral zones and ports. Universities formed joint programs with leading institutions in Asia and the Middle East. Local currencies stabilized as reserves grew. Lifestyle standards improved. Cities became safer, cleaner, and more technologically advanced. For the millions who had migrated from the UK, the integration was smooth. Many became respected figures in the industries they joined. Some drove new innovations in energy and technology. Others revitalized sectors such as tourism, digital entertainment, agriculture, and finance. They brought ideas that blended with the continent's ingenuity, creating synergy that propelled whole industries forward. Back in the UK, the narrative continued to deteriorate. A major real estate association reported a national surplus of unsold homes, something that had not happened in decades. Rental agencies slashed prices to attract tenants. Commercial properties in London were auctioned at a fraction of their former value. The once golden British property market was losing its shine. The economic strain spilled into politics. Parliamentary debates grew heated, with factions blaming each other for the country's decline. Proposals emerged to curb migration, but they targeted the wrong direction, trying to restrict inflows instead of understanding the massive outflow. Critics pointed out that blocking immigration only worsened labor shortages and accelerated decline. Pragmatic voices called for deeper partnerships with Africa, recognizing that the continent Britain once saw as a developing region had become a powerful global player. These voices urged new trade agreements, investment pacts, and collaborative initiatives to rebuild economic bridges. But others resisted, still clinging to outdated geopolitical assumptions. This internal conflict paralyzed policy as the crisis deepened. Meanwhile, Africa continued to thrive. New regional manufacturing chains shifted. Global attention. Electric vehicle battery production soared in the south, agritech innovation surged in the east. West African fintech systems influenced global banking models. North African solar projects contributed significantly to global renewable energy supply. Central Africa's infrastructure boom unlocked previously untapped markets. It was a continental renaissance, driven not only by local talent but by the infusion of global talent fleeing declining economies. The UK eventually faced the reality that its economic survival depended on embracing Africa's rise rather than resisting it. It sought new partnerships, new energy deals, and new investment corridors. Yet African nations negotiated from a position of strength. They offered cooperation, but on terms that reflected the new global order, one where Africa no longer played a supporting role but led in multiple sectors. In the final analysis, Britain's decline was not simply the result of people leaving. It was the consequence of opportunity shifting. As Africa expanded its influence, wealth, and capability, the gravitational pull changed. The world's economic center of gravity slowly but steadily moved southward. The millions who relocated were not traitors or deserters. They were seekers of opportunity, people who recognized that prosperity was no longer guaranteed in the UK. Their movement did not merely mark the decline of Britain. It illuminated the rise of Africa. The global narrative transformed. What was once described as the developing world had now become the driving engine of growth, and what was once described as one of the most stable economies on Earth was now struggling to adapt to a new reality. In the end, history would view this era not as a collapse but as a transition, a moment when global power realigned, when Africa stepped into the economic spotlight, and when millions choosing new futures reshaped the fate of nations. Africa rose because it embraced possibility. The UK declined because it depended on the past, and the movement of millions sealed the shift that changed everything.